Number two, he said, Zion, meaning Palestine, will be redeemed in justice. In other words, if we're not just in the way we run Palestine, we don't deserve Palestine. And he repeated this over and over again from the late 1920s until he couldn't speak anymore.
It is a pleasure to be here for, as Susan said, our fourth event in the Brandeis University Press Ford Hall Forum GBH author series, and it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Reinharz.
Just the background of who Weizmann was. Weizmann was born in one of these forlorn, tiny little villages in Russia. Place doesn't mean anything to anybody at this point, and got his education in Germany, later on in Switzerland. He majored in the sciences, particularly chemistry, and for all kinds of reasons which have to do, familiar to those of you who are at universities, he knew he couldn't get tenure at any of the universities in Europe, and so in 1904, he decided to move to Manchester, England, and got a job as a very junior faculty member at the University of Manchester, where he taught for about 10 years. He never became a professor for all kinds of reasons, mostly, as any of you who know our universities work, a lot of politics go on, and for all kinds of reasons, he was denied the professorship. He became a reader. And that's really the background to Weizmann, and that's where I'd like to start. That is, he comes to England, as I said, in 1904, and then he begins to be involved with the Jewish community in Manchester, particularly with the Zionist organizations there. And being somebody who came from Europe, from Russia, spoke Yiddish, and could communicate well with the immigrant population in Manchester, he began to make inroads into that community, became had a kind of minor position in the English Zionist Federation. And that's really when the part of the story that I'm going to tell you about becomes a little more complicated. I should mention one other thing. Weizmann began already before World War I to think of creating a university in Palestine. I'm not going to go through all the machinations that took him to create the university, but the university was in fact established in the mid-1920s in Palestine, which had at that point not too many students, no faculty. But the Hebrew University of Jerusalem owes its creation to Weizmann well before he became involved as a major figure in the Zionist organization. So as I said, Weizmann was a Zionist, somebody who was used to get people moving and doing things, and a training he received really in Switzerland while he was a student, where most of the time, anytime in the afternoon, all these students would gather, and all they did is discuss Zionism, the world, etc. He was a Zionist, a dedicated Zionist. And in 1914, he decides that if somebody would just pay his train ticket from Manchester to London, he would be able to convince the largest empire in the world, namely Great Britain, to support the Zionist organization. Now, there was absolutely no rational reason for this. I mean, most people did not know what Zionism is. It was a tiny organization of no real importance. And yet, 10 years later, less than that, 8 years later, I want to read you what what is written about him in the Daily Express, large British newspaper. Does it still exist? On October 28th, 1922. And it's, and if you read that particular paper, there's a picture of Weizmann on the front page of the Daily Express, October 28, 1922. And there's a picture of Weizmann, not as good as this one, but a picture of Weizmann. And it says the following headline: Mystery of the great Chaim Weizmann, last of the foreigners who meddle with British affairs, Palestine morass, the genius that lured and keeps us there. And beneath this bizarre cloud bank of headlines, the article goes on. One of those masterminds who dominate the destinies of nation. Who is this man of mystery? His name is Dr. Chaim Weizmann. He is the president of the Zionist Organization, unsurpassed, according to the Express, in his genius for exerting a hidden mastery over the minds of our simple British politicians. His genius it was, what did I do? That lured us. So I shouldn't touch it. British politician. His genius it was that lured us step by step into the morass of Palestine. His genius it is that keeps us there and will keep us there until we sink up to the neck in irretrievable disasters. Now, you have to ask yourself, here comes a guy, a minor figure, even in the larger Zionist organization. I'm not talking about England, but the World Zionist Organization. And this is the headline. Now, it's clearly has anti-Semitic overtones or undertones, whatever they are. And so within 8 years, Weizmann is well known enough for the Daily Express to write this kind of an article. You know, many people have wondered, how is it that Weizmann has been able to do what he did? And people ask me all the time, well, how did he do it? What was his power? Well, if you think about it, what was his power? He had no power. The power of personality, it's perhaps the only or last or one of few events in history where a person without any power, person who doesn't have an army behind him, doesn't have land, doesn't even have the Zionist organization behind him, what's his power? So that's what I'm going to try to dig in the next few minutes that I have. But as I said, I think it's one of the few occasions that I know of somebody who in fact has no power, who gains a great deal of power. So Weizmann's political life in the Zionist organization really impacted the lives and the destinies of three peoples. Obviously the Jews, the British, and the Arabs. And I'm going to say a few words about each one of this, and as I said, I'm going to try to keep to the time limit. So if I were to ask any of you, what do you know about Weizmann? I've asked that question of many people. So usually people know that if they know anything about him, they know something about something called the Balfour Declaration. And they may know that he was the first president of the State of Israel. What I'm going to try to demonstrate to you, and I truly believe it after having spent a lot of time on Chaim Weizmann for 40 years, off and on. It's not the only thing I did. In fact, as I said, most people don't know. Most people have no idea. They know perhaps of the Balfour Declaration. They know perhaps that he was the president of the World Zionist Organization. They know perhaps that he was president of Israel. They have no idea. When I ask people on the streets or in wherever, you know anything about Chaim Weizmann? They say, yeah, Ezra Weizmann. Or they ask Weizmann Institute. So how did a person without any connection convince the largest empire in the world to do what he wanted them to do? Now think about England. England at that time, during World War I and beyond, controlled 48 countries, 258 million people, the largest empire in the world, six times larger than the Roman Empire. And here comes a guy with, as I said before, who has absolutely no connections, no power, and convinces the powers in England to support the Zionist organization. There's one thing I haven't told you. Weizmann was a scientist, as I mentioned early on. And during World War I, Britain, and I'm going to come back to this later, Great Britain needed to have acetone. Many of you know what acetone is, but what they needed is distilled acetone. Acetone that's distilled. Why? Because it was very important for keeping the barrels of guns, of any kind of thing that shot, from overheating. It was an important invention because when you fire and the guns, the barrels, have been lubricated with acetone, they don't show any kind of, you can't tell where the shot is coming from. There's no, what do you call this? There's no smoke anywhere, and you can't, very important during World War I. Now, Great Britain needed acetone badly during the war, and thanks. And, but it was unaffordable. It used to be imported from Finland. Synthetic acetone is made from the distillation of wood. All the wood in England would have been insufficient in order to produce the kind of acetone that they needed. So Weizmann was the only scientist who was able to invent, and Britain, the great powers in England looked everywhere, the only one who figured out how to do it. He did it from the distillation of potatoes, corn, all kinds of other things that he found, and was able to produce 30,000 tons of synthetic acetone every single month during the war. So amazing. Now, why is this important? It's important because of a couple of reasons. One, he received a job or a position in the Admiralty because he needed to have all these factories commandeered so that he could produce the acetone, 30,000 tons of acetone every month. And because of that, he got to know everybody in England he wanted to meet. So all of a sudden, he becomes an important man in England. The British are grateful. They found somebody who can not save them, but provide a very important element that was important for the war. And Weizmann meets everyone in high society. In the midst of all of this, Weizmann becomes a persona grata in everybody's home. And by the way, after the war, he becomes very wealthy. Why does he become wealthy? I neglected to mention he was very poor at the beginning of the war. He becomes wealthy because a byproduct of acetone was important in the production of cars after World War I. Cars were then produced in large numbers. It was used to lacquer the cars, obviously an important ingredient. So, I said before, most people know about the Balfour Declaration, which is attributed to Weizmann. It's all these Brandeis people sitting here. So, what does the Balfour Declaration say? Balfour Declaration was given in 1917 Actually, we just had the anniversary of Balfour Declaration a few days ago, last week. And what does it say? It's one sentence, which I'll read you. It's a letter from Lord Balfour to Lord Rothschild, who had presented it. It's not actually to Weizmann, even though Weizmann is the person behind it. And it says the following: His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use its best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other countries. One sentence. It says in Palestine, doesn't say of Palestine. Very important distinction. By the way, more books have been written about this one sentence than any sentence. I checked once with Claude and all the other great things that we have today, and I said, who has written books about one sentence? Now I also wrote a book on one sentence, but that's besides the point. So I want to talk about, and I'll do this very quickly. Who did Weizmann impact during his years in England? And by the way, he became, in his own view and in view of others, he became a Brit. He was a Zionist, he was a Jew, and he was a Brit. And he acted like a Brit. He dressed like one, like this guy. Always with a tie, a suit. He had a large home. I visited the home. And he had people working in the home, a nanny for the kids, and he had a chauffeur, a car, so he had a home there. Eventually he had a home also in Palestine, which many people call a palace. And, but he also liked to live in the Victoria Hotel in London for some reason, but that's another story. So Weizmann impacted Jews, impacted the British, impacted the Arabs. I'll say a word about each one of them. Weizmann had very little use for Jews who pretended that they have forgotten to speak Yiddish, who pretended that they had little to do with the Jewish community, and he actually despised them. He also had one important reason that he didn't want to go to Poland, for example, or to Russia again. He couldn't stand what he called Luftmenschen, people who lived from the air. People didn't have work to do. And he thought that the multitudes in those countries, Jews, were of that kind. And by the way, he tried to prevent them from coming to Palestine. But that's, again, a side story here. What about so he had very little use for them. On the other hand, it was clear to him that what he wanted was to bring pioneers to Palestine. Weizmann was enamored with those people who established kibbutzim, moshavim, agricultural colonies in Palestine. These were the kinds of people that he admired, and these are the kinds of people he visited when he came to Palestine. So, Weizmann, during his years, I should say, he became the president of the World Zionist Organization in 1920, and served as the president until 1946, with one interruption of 4 years when he was not elected, actually because he didn't want to run. But for the rest of the period, he was the president of the World Zionist Organization. But his years as president of the World Zionist Organization also saw a lot of opposition to him. I'll just mention two or three incidents. In the 1920s, he was opposed by the most important Jew in the world. You'll probably say Einstein. Well, it was really Louis Brandeis. Louis Brandeis, who was the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, first Jew to sit on the Supreme Court. And Louis Brandeis came to the conclusion that it was no longer necessary to promote political Zionism. Political Zionism has found its solution with the Balfour Declaration. And he thought that Zionism was now an economic enterprise. Weizmann totally disagreed. And he did something that was very courageous. He said, I'm going to go to the next convention of the Zionist Organization in the United States. I'm going to fight Louis Brandeis there. And it shows you that Weizmann already understood public relations. He turned to Albert Einstein, who was his friend in those days. Later on, they fought, of course. And he said to him, Albert, I need you to come with me to Cleveland. This is where the convention took place. Einstein said, what for? He said, I want you, you're the most important person in the world, a Jewish person in the world. I want you to come. And Einstein said, you know, I can't speak. I can't deliver a lecture. Weizmann said, I know. But all I want you to do is when I speak, you sit on the stage and you look at the audience. By the way, try not to fall asleep. And he took him from city to city in the United States. And poor Albert was sitting there looking at the audience and probably knew the lecture by heart at that point. And Weizmann defeated Louis Brandeis in Cleveland in 1921. This was unheard of. So Weizmann already understood public relations. There's another aspect to that story, so I'm going to tell it now. As Weizmann finishes in Cleveland, he's being told that the High Commissioner for Palestine, Herbert Samuel, was meeting with Bedouin tribes. And Weizmann hears, I mean, this is not, phones were not there, all these little phones that we have today. And he doesn't really know what happened. So he takes the first boat back to Palestine because he worries that Herbert Samuel is doing some deal with the Bedouins that might harm the Zionist prospects in Palestine. And he comes to on a Friday, actually, he arrives in England, London, and he calls up Arthur Balfour. Arthur James Balfour was the foreign minister of England. And here you begin to understand Weizmann's power. And he says to him, tomorrow morning, at your house, I would like to have the following people. I want the prime minister. I want the minister for the colonies, which was Churchill. I want Balfour. I want you, Balfour, obviously, to be there. And he names a whole bunch of other people who he wants there. And he says, tomorrow at 10 o'clock. And Balfour says, okay. So you have to say to yourself, you know, where does this guy come from? I mean, where does this, you know, ability to convince somebody to, like the prime minister? Well, the next day they all show up. And Weizmann does something that is not done in England. Well, it's done in Israel, but not in England. He lambasts Herbert Samuel in front of his superior. His superior is Churchill. And Churchill says, well, wait a minute. Is this all true? He says, okay, don't pay attention to Herbert Samuel. He said, what can I do for you? He said, by the way, I know that you are smuggling weapons to Palestine. The Haganah was already being formed in 1920. And he says, you know what? Go ahead and do it. Just don't tell anybody. I'm going to cover for you. And Weizmann says to him, I want you to restrain Herbert Samuel. And Churchill said, and the prime minister says to Churchill, is this all true? And he says, yes. He said, take care of it. I come back to this question of where does this come from? So I'm going to go back to some of his opposition. Of course, in the 1930s, he was opposed by people like Jabotinsky, who wanted the kind of occupation of other territories that Weizmann was not in line with, and of course, eventually with Ben-Gurion. One thing you have to understand about Weizmann, Weizmann was an elitist. He had a small group around him who advised him. He had no use for parties. He did not understand party politics, the politics of the masses. which eventually harmed him. But he had his own group of people. He decided who's going to be in that group. They made all the decisions. Somebody in that group aggravated him at some point. Out he went. So Weizmann really, both in the, and throughout the 1940s, this is the way he acted. In the 1940s, he fought a losing battle against those who wanted to have greater control of the movement, people like Ben Gurion and so on. But I won't go into those details. That will take us the entire evening. So I want to read to you another passage which I found in the archives as I was working on the Weizmann story. I read you the story before from the Daily Express. I want to read you I don't think it's in the book, actually. You guys who have read my book have to tell me. I don't remember anymore if it's in the book. I found a play that George Bernard Shaw wrote. Is it in the book? Okay. Called Acetone. And it's called Arthur and the Acetone, Arthur James Balfour and the Acetone. And it has to do with what I told you before about acetone. Acetone was a rare product in England at the time. England needed it badly. And George Bernard Shaw, who was a certified anti-Semite, wrote this play, and you'll see in a minute what he writes. And the first act is Arthur talks to one of his lieutenants, and he says, I'm going to read you. These are not long, it's not a long play. He says, I don't know what acetone is, and I don't care. I know that if we go on like this, we will have to give an order to cease killing Germans. Dead Germans cost too much. Are our chemists trying to find something cheaper? Attaché, they're doing their best, but nothing has come out of it so far. There is a chemist in Manchester who has a microbe that makes acetone for next to nothing. Arthur, send him here instantly. Why hasn't he been sent here before? Attaché, impossible, sir, unfortunately. Arthur, nothing is impossible when we're at war. Why is it impossible? Attaché, he's a Jew, sir. Arthur, is his microbe a Jew? Attaché, I suppose not, sir. Arthur James Balfour, is Herbert Samuel a Jew or is he not? Is he in the cabinet or is he not? Herbert Samuel had been the Postmaster General in the British cabinet, first Jew ever to serve in a British cabinet. So, is he a Jew or is he not? Attaché, but it's a coalition government, sir. All kinds of people are let in. Arthur, any other objection? Attaché, well, Manchester, I'm sorry. Manchester, sir, provincial, and Owens College. If it were Oxford or Cambridge, now we might stretch a point. Arthur, if this Jewish gentleman is not in the room in 3 hours, you go to the trenches. Attaché, okay, if you make a point of it, we shall bring him, but we will lose tone, meaning we will lose face. So that brings us to Act 2, which is the only other act I'm going to read you. And just as before, Arthur is sitting there, and Chaim Weizmann is there instead of the attaché. And I'll tell you in a minute why all of this is important. And so Arthur James Balfour says, Dr. Weizmann, we must have your microbe at your own price. Name it. We shall not hesitate at 6 figures. Dr. Weizmann, I do not ask for money. Arthur, there must be a misunderstanding. I was informed that you are a Jew. Weizmann, you were informed correctly. I am a Jew. Arthur, but pardon me, you said you did not ask for any money. Weizmann, precisely, I do not want money. Arthur, a title perhaps, Baron, Lord, do not hesitate. Weizmann, nothing would induce me to accept a title. I should have to pay more for everything if I had a title. Arthur, then may I ask without offense, since you want none of the things that everybody wants, what the devil do you want? Weizmann, I want Jerusalem. Arthur, it's yours. I only regret that we cannot throw in Madagascar as well. Unfortunately, it belongs to the French government. The Holy Land, on the other hand, belongs naturally to the Church of England, and to it you are most welcome. And now, will you be so good as to hand over the microbe? Now, why am I reading it? It's not just to entertain you, but it shows you that Bernard Shaw could write a play called Acetone, Arthur and the Acetone, Arthur James Balfour and the Acetone, in 1936, and people will know who he's talking about. Just like the previous article that was, I don't know, 8 years earlier or 10 years, whatever it is. So it shows you the power of the man, the fact that he is well known, and Weizmann also knew how to promote himself. As he was leaving after this affair that I mentioned before in 1921, where he asked Balfour to bring all these people, he writes him a letter and says, I'm going off to America now. And he says, just remember, my constituency ranges, and he mentions some outrageous stuff from Madagascar to, whatever. And Balfour writes him back and he says, I hope you'll say nice things about us when you get to the United States. By the way, Weizmann met every American president, beginning with Wilson in 1919, and of course, ending up with, I'll get to him, in 1947, 48. So Truman, obviously. So once again, you have to ask yourself, where does this power come? It's the power of personality. Weizmann's, I would say that one of Weizmann's greatest achievements was the fact that he persuaded the British for 30 years that the Balfour Declaration was a real commitment on the part of the British. And you have to say to yourself, the British wrote these kinds of letters, Balfour-like letters, to the Arabs, to all kinds of people. By the way, this was common practice. The Germans did it, the Russians did it, even Japan did it. I find all kinds of letters written to the Zionist Organization of a similar nature. So the difference is they didn't have a Weizmann. Now, people ask me all the time, so where does this power come from? The fact of the matter is, I don't know. I don't understand how somebody with so little power, no army, no land, no, etc., as I said before, is able to meet everyone in Europe he wants to meet. He went to the Vatican. He didn't meet the Pope, but he met his people, this archbishop, this archbishop. He met with Mussolini 4 times. Mussolini asked him to come and see him. He saw prime ministers and presidents in all European countries. He was on close terms with the president of France. There was no one who would not see him. And once again, we don't know where does this power come from, except the power of personalities. I just want to illustrate this to you one more time. I mentioned the meeting with Balfour. In 1929, there were major riots in Palestine. Lots of people were killed, Jews, Arabs, also some British. And the British did what they always do in such instances. They sent a commission to Palestine. And the commission came back and said, this happened and that happened. Well, what are your conclusions? We need to limit immigration to Palestine. And the prime minister of England at the time says, I guess that's what we have to do. And the British, and I'm obviously simplifying, they produce what they always do, is a white paper. A white paper is the law of the land. And Weizmann goes to the prime minister, and he says to him, if you do this, if the white paper actually comes out, I'm going to resign. Now, if I were the prime minister, I would say to him, go ahead and resign. The prime minister is shaken. He said, no, I don't want you to resign. Because if you resign, he knows, if Weizmann resigns, it's a major event. Weizmann was on familiar terms with all the major figures in parliament. They had all come to his house for dinners. He went to their houses. He spoke to them as an equal. And the Prime Minister Prime Minister MacDonald knew that Weizmann could actually get him fired if he put his mind to it. And he says, okay, what do you want? And so, again, simplifying, they created another small commission. They came up with the right answer. And the white paper was rescinded. Now, I want you to understand something. In the entire history of England, of Great Britain, there's no such instance that a white paper was rescinded because an individual, a citizen, said, I don't like it. I think that, and by the way, it hasn't happened since. So you can imagine what I'm just trying to illustrate to you, the power Weizmann had. My time is up, but so I'll just mention one thing and maybe we'll talk about it later. As I said at the beginning, Weizmann's term as president of the Zionist Organization and until he became president of Israel in 1949 was sort of coming to a kind of a sad end. If you look at the Declaration of Independence of Israel, which was obviously written in Hebrew, you see that after the letter Vav, or the letter V, however you would explain it, there's a space that has not been signed. Now, most people predict, or many people predict, or assume that this was in order to leave space for Weizmann. In Hebrew, that's where the signature would have been in. It's not, it's empty. One of the things that I mentioned before in passing is that Weizmann was not a man of the people. He saw himself as who he was, important person. He did not associate, he did not understand the politics of the masses. He didn't understand how important it is to create a party. He never had a party. And he was dismissive throughout the 1920s, 30s, 40s of Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion came to England, spent a lot of time in England. Weizmann did not give him any opportunity to really play a major role in Zionist politics. He invited Ben-Gurion to his house for dinner only once, and Vera Weizmann, Weizmann's wife, said he doesn't know how to dress. He came without a tie, sort of unheard of in England, and he was never invited again. And they had actually only one thing in common. Both Weizmann and Ben-Gurion admired Weizmann. But Weizmann had no use for Ben-Gurion. He thought he was a simple laborer, farmer, uncouth, somebody who didn't know how to behave in fine company. And, Ben-Gurion paid him back. Weizmann was made president of Israel, but with very little power. He lived in Rehovot, where he had built himself a really very nice house. And if you can say this, might not sound nice, he lived 3-4 years too long. His last years were very sad years. He had no access to any really important event or decision in Israel. And sometimes people visited him, but he died an old man. I mean, he wasn't that old. Sick. He'd always been sick, even as a young person. And it was a sad ending. I want to say one other thing about the Arab problem, which I did not mention. I want to mention it now. Weizmann, from day one, understood that it is important to have contact with the Arab population in Palestine. He came to Palestine for the second time, actually, in 1918. And one of the first acts he did was to go and meet with the Emir Faisal, who was the son of the Sharif of Mecca, a very important person in the Arab world. And his whole reason for going to meet him was to say, we can live together, Arabs and Jews, in the same land. They actually signed a contract. They signed a contract that Jews and the Arabs will work together, et cetera, et cetera. For all kinds of reasons, the Faisal abrogated the agreement a year later. He was afraid he'll be murdered by radicals in the Arab world. But Weizmann tried to meet many times with Arab leaders, the Mufti of Jerusalem, all the Nashashibis, et cetera, and the Husseinis, and got nowhere. So, I mean, I can elaborate on this, but the fact of the matter is that in 1937, for a moment, it looked like the Peel Commission would recommend that the land be divided between Jews and Arabs, but then World War II broke out, and Weizmann pleaded with anybody who would listen to him. He said, I am willing to have a Jewish homeland that is, these were his words, the size of a handkerchief, because I want to save the Jews of Europe. And by the way, he did a great deal during the war to try to save German Jewry, Austrian, and all the other Jewries being impacted by. But that was too late and too little, and nothing came of it. So, thank you very much, and I'm ready to talk to you.
Thank you so much for the talk, but especially thank you for the book. What I'd like to do, just to have a few minutes before we open up to the audience for questions, is to talk with you about the larger implications of the work that you've presented this evening and in your book. Because I think when people teach about Zionism and the history of Israel, when books are written about it, and certainly in the sort of self-presentation or the self-mythologizing of the Zionist movement, as you yourself pointed out, Weizmann does not play a major role. And what are the images that are on people's minds? You know, there's Herzl on the balcony. You then skip straight to people draining swamps and malaria and mass immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe and Ben Gurion on the beach. These are the images that the Zionist movement sort of promotes in its own storytelling about itself. But your work recenters the story of Zionism in the first half of the 20th century away from farmers in Palestine to smoke-filled back rooms of Westminster. And I wonder if you could say a word about what you think that means for the way we have to maybe reimagine the way the story of Zionism in those years is told. The place of empire, the place of Britain, the place of diplomacy over sort of immigration and sort of active building up of the land.
Well, we really have to go back to something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. I think what most people perhaps don't appreciate is that the great powers, Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy played a tiny role there too, they really controlled what happened in the Middle East, as well as in other places. So the Sykes-Picot Agreement was an agreement which was made between two people, doesn't matter their names right now, Sykes and Picot, obviously, and which actually thought of how to divide the Middle East. it was clear what Great Britain, which always had many people in government who were very close, also religiously, to Palestine, to the Bible, and so on. It was clear they were going to get Palestine, also got what is today Iraq, parts of Syria, etc. The French had their own interests in Lebanon and what became Syria later on. That is how the world functioned. And so the idea that people had actually the power to make decisions was just not there. And Turkey, by the way, for those of you who know that history, controlled Palestine for 400 years until 1917. And so these are how decisions were made between the great powers without any regard to what. Now, in this case, as I try to illustrate, the Zionist organization was lucky to have somebody like Weizmann, who in fact became part of the British establishment. But what happened to the letters that were written to the Kurds, to the Arabs, to other nationalities? Nothing ever came of them. So I don't know if that answers your question, but keep on asking me so that you'll get to what you want.
No, I think it does answer the question. I think that your intervention really demonstrates the importance of thinking about Zionism in global context, in imperial context, but also in global context. And I think that it reminds us that it's one of the many, many national movements that arose at this moment of the crumbling of empires, first the Ottoman Empire, but of course then the British Empire itself. And Weizmann being this kind of pivotal figure at that moment, at that crucial time.
Mm-hmm. So, given Weizmann's role, I mean, actually, if you open a book on the history of Zionism, you will have read about Theodor Herzl, and you will have heard about Ben-Gurion. Weizmann just doesn't show up. If he shows up, it's a footnote. Now, when I started, how did I get into Weizmann? When I read his autobiography, which is beautifully written, by the way, he didn't write it all. He was too old when it was finally published. He had a good editor. And it's a beautiful biography, except that much of it is not true. It's all good.
It's an autobiography that wasn't written by him.
Who writes autobiographies? I mean, people who want people to know certain things about them, but not all of it.
Yeah.
And there's certain, as I read the biography then with other eyes when I grew up, I read it first as a 14-year-old, I began to see things that I said, that's not true. So, and it's all in the book. But that's how people knew if they wanted to know something about Weizmann. But beyond that, he just doesn't appear as a major force. Now, my contention, by the way, I shouldn't just talk in first person. My contention is that of my co-author, Motti Golani, is that without Weizmann, there would not have been a state, the state of Israel, certainly not in 1948.
So let me ask, I think there's time for maybe one or two other brief exchanges between us before we open this up to the audience for questions. My sense is that among a lot of people today, and maybe even in previous decades as well, when you say the word Zionism, the impression one gets is of a sort of a monolithic organization, of a single ideology. Of course, historians know that nothing could be further from the truth. And reading your book, I mean, I did know a little about Weizmann beforehand, but I learned a great deal more, of course, reading this work. And it is astonishing the number of profound and serious disagreements somebody even of his stature had again and again and again with all of the major figures. I mean, this is an extremely incomplete list. So he disagreed with Herzl about the democratic and democracy and transparency of the Zionist movement. He disagreed with Reinharz about the role of religion and culture in Zionism. He disagreed with Motti and Usishkin about the leadership of Russian Zionism and Sokolov of the place of socialism in Zionism, on Achad Ha'am and how pragmatist the Zionist movement should be, with Simon Marx, a close ally, but on the diplomatic relationships with the British, and on Brandeis, as you talked about, and with Magnus and how to run Hebrew University, with Einstein, and of course Ben Gurion and Jabotinsky, et cetera, et cetera. And it's impossible to read your work without coming away with the deep understanding of how many streams there are within the broader Zionist movement, how many streams of thought there are. And I wonder if you could say a word perhaps of the legacy of that, the variety of Zionisms, I think we need to use the plural, from Weizmann's life, even until the Zionist movement today, both in terms of how the Zionist movement developed in those times, and also perhaps what, if anything, is left of Weizmann's legacy in terms of his own Zionist ideology in the Zionism that we see in the 21st century.
Weizmann was involved in many of these debates from the last part of the 19th century and pretty much until he came to Palestine. And I think that's what made the Zionist organization a strong organization. The fact that the debates, if you read any of the debates in Congress that took place every 2 years, all they did is shout at each other and fight about ideas until they crystallized in a party, in a particular party, or crystallized in some, or fell apart. Weizmann had two expressions that he used all the time, and which are sort of interesting in thinking of today's events. One was, we don't want to rule, but we also don't want to be ruled. But if somebody were to come to attack us, we will defend ourselves. I don't know if it rings a bell now. Number two, he said, Zion, meaning Palestine, will be redeemed in justice. In other words, if we're not just in the way we run Palestine, we don't deserve Palestine. And he repeated this over and over again from the late 1920s until he couldn't speak anymore. These were his two expressions, and he truly believed in them. I think that also what is perhaps interesting, sort of relating back to your question, is a lot of these debates were taking place not only in Palestine, they took place in every place the Jews lived in. I mean, this is how they communicated. This is how they communicate today. A lot of debates, a lot of discussions, and eventually things crystallize in one form or another. I don't know if this is different from any other kind of national movement, but except for 2 or 3 cases, they didn't kill each other. There are such instances in Zionist historiography, as you know. But even as students, I mean, this is how they spent their times in Switzerland, in Germany, wherever they lived, in, of course, England. Student organizations were formed, Zionist student organizations, in opposition to each other, and debated until late at night. And eventually, they either disagreed and became separate parties. Weizmann was never one of them because, as I mentioned before, he did not understand the psychology and the power of movements. He was an elitist.
May I ask you one last question before we turn it over?
As many as you want.
This is, I think this is coming from me as a historian to a historian that I've admired for a very long time. I believe the first thing that you published about Chaim Weizmann came out in 1977, when you published in one of the volumes of his letters. So you've been writing about Weizmann for a very long time. My question is there any way that your Weizmann, the way that you've seen him, thought about him, has changed over that period of close to 50 years? As you've discovered more about him, How has Weizmann changed for you?
Well, the Weizmann I knew when I first edited a volume of his letters, which I actually did in 1973.
Even earlier, okay.
During the Yom Kippur War. When you read his letters, Weizmann, by the way, from very early on, he saved copies of his letters. He even saved a copy of a letter he wrote when he was 11 years old. And I've often wondered, why did he save these letters? I think he had a sense of himself that he's going to do something important. But when you read his letters, you obviously read letters that somebody writes to other people, and he portrays himself in a certain way. And by the way, some of the things he writes are not true. I'll give you one example. Do you want to have an example?
Of course.
In 1903, he sits in his lab in Switzerland, and the Kishinev pogrom takes place. It's a pogrom where many Jews were killed, city of Kishinev, obviously. And many Jews are murdered. And eventually this is calmed down by the police and also Jewish defense. And this is 1903. In 1911, he writes a letter to a woman he tried to impress. Weizmann, by the way, liked women. And he writes to her, he said, in 1903, there was this pogrom in Kishinev. I was sitting in my lab. I heard what happened. I rushed to Kishinev. I organized the defense force, and we beat those hoodlums, etc. And they ran away or something like that. Nothing of that happened. So I looked in all the archives I could find, and I found there was a Weizmann in Kishinev at the time. It was his brother. And Weizmann must have figured when he wrote his autobiography, nobody would ever figure this out, which Weizmann was in Kishinev, if he even thought this way. So he was very concerned about his image. One of the decisions I made early on is that I would visit every place Weizmann lived in. And when you visit those, of course, these places have changed over time, but you get some sense of how he grew up in this miserable place called Motti, in a place that had, totally out of the way. And later on, I visited all the hotels he lived in. I visited his homes, and I actually also met some surviving people who knew him. And you realize that you have to get a much deeper understanding of Weizmann rather than just what you read in the letters. When I read the letters, this is Weizmann writing. He's portraying himself. They're very important because they give you all kinds of insights. But if you really want to understand the biography of anyone, you've got to make that route, which is why I'm not going to write another biography, because it's exhausting.
Thank you very much for answering my questions. And now we turn to the audience in the room and on Zoom.
Thank you. I was a little curious how you would describe Weizmann's political acumen, because you describe a man who doesn't care much for party politics, but his understanding of it seems to not be deficient. He seems to have read Prime Minister MacDonald fairly well, a man who would prove to be quite easily pushed around and discarded from his own party. And I was just curious, despite his own dislike of party politics, how would you describe his own political acumen, as it were?
Well, clearly he was quite successful. But it's really the power of persuasion, the power of personality. I don't know any other way to describe it. He flourished in Great Britain. He flourished when finally the Zionist organization decided that they have to abandon Great Britain to some extent and move to the United States, to America. And Weizmann could communicate well with people who were in power. He had a more difficult time dealing with people, the common people. It was just not in his, except for one group of people. He loved the farmers, the people who lived on the kibbutzim and moshavim in these communities in Palestine. He admired them. But for the rest, he was an elitist. He dealt with the elite. And, till the very end, if some of you may know, President Truman did not really want to see Weizmann. He was persuaded to see him. And Weizmann, the first meeting he had with Truman, he did something that you don't do. He came with a map. He spreads the map on the table, and he says to Truman, this is Palestine. This is what I want. Now, Truman had never heard of the Negev. He didn't know what he's talking about. But he said, this is what I want. These are the territories. After that, he saw him 2 more times. When he was elected president, he was the first. He thought, by the way, he's going to be president like Truman. Ben-Gurion had different ideas for what a president would mean in the context of Israel, which is still the case today. Little power. And he could deal with people of that sort. He had a harder time, as I said before, dealing with the masses. This was not for him. Does that answer your question? If not, ask again.
With him having less respect for people who he saw as like shiftless in Eastern Europe, what his view of the Israel to come was, did he picture it, significantly different? Did he picture it differently than Ben-Gurion? Did he was he aiming for something more like England with these more elite circles, or
I don't know if I'll satisfy you with this answer, but Weizmann felt comfortable, I already said, in England, and one other place, Switzerland. These were the places where he was most comfortable with. It's not that he had no respect for people who were not of that stature. He disliked going to Poland and didn't visit Poland by the time he left Russia. I think he visited Poland once. He disliked people who did not work, who did not really produce something that's useful. And he felt in Palestine, then Israel, he felt out of place. He felt that, part of it was the fact that he had no power. But it was not an issue of lack of respect. It was lack of interest in dealing with people who were not either producing or had something to contribute to Zionism.
And we have one Zoom question. The question is, was Weizmann a secular Jew?
He was raised as, I would say, moderate Orthodoxy in a household where everybody was, I would say, observant Jew. By the way, Weizmann had 11 brothers and sisters. He took care of all of them when he made his money. And by the way, sort of relating to your question, they were not all Zionists. He had one brother who became actually a communist later on and disappeared in Russia at some point. He had a sister who married a non-Jew, which was a big scandal at that time. but um, I don't know if I'm answering your question. Say that again?
Was Weizmann a secular Jew?
Oh, and he became more and more secular. He went to what was called a cheder, a place where, a room, literally, where everybody studied as from a young age. And this was not for him. He was a rebel early on. His grandfather saved him from some of the need to go to early in the morning and study all day. But he did not observe Jewish holidays. He did not keep kosher. But he had great respect for Jewish tradition. He read the Bible often. But I don't know what you would term him. He was a proud Jew, but he was not religious, did not observe any customs and rarely went to synagogue.
Great, thank you. And we have time for one more question.
I want to pick up on something that Alex spoke about and that you responded to, and that I thought a lot about when I read the biography. Usually it's the winners who get to write the history. So it's the disciples of Ben Gurion who made it so that Weizmann was forgotten in histories that have been written since, then and since. So I was wondering, when the Hebrew version came out and now when the English one volume comes out, are you getting pushback from the Ben Gurionites? Are you getting critiques from that whole crowd who say, how can you, just because, right, how can you speak like that about Ben Gurion? And of course, Weizmann didn't do anything.
They haven't had a chance to write their critique of the book yet, but it will come. Look, I think for a long time, people knew of Herzl still. You know who Herzl is? Just to give you an example, a few years ago, the Zionist archives in Israel, think about this, the Zionist archives in Israel, where I've worked for many years, had a seminar on major figures in the history of Zionism. Weizmann did not appear. I called him up. I said, have you ever heard of Weizmann? And obviously they have. I said, how is it possible that he's not there? Oh, we forgot. But just think about that. So I think, look, there's a whole institute, actually more than one, devoted to the legacy of Ben Gurion. Everybody knows who Ben Gurion is. If I say Weizmann, people will say, as I mentioned before, they'll say, Ezra Weizmann, the Weizmann Institute, what are you talking about? They just don't know. Students who study in high school rarely hear about him. And if they hear about him, it's sort of in passing. There was this guy, and they may mention the Balfour Declaration and Weizmann, but beyond that, it won't. So I think it's going to aggravate a lot of people, this book, which is good. And maybe eventually he will make it into the great panoply of leaders of Israel, but it's going to take a while. And so far, the reviews of the book have been positive, but I'm waiting for the ones who will say, the problem is they can't argue with facts. So unless somebody can prove that what I wrote about Weizmann or what we wrote about Weizmann is untrue, but it takes a while. Until he makes it into the historiography in a real way, it's going to be a number of years. It's my assessment.